Welcome to Pandora's Puzzles, where we use the lenses of philosophy, science, religion, and literature to explore the paradoxes of modern life. During this journey, we turn our eyes outward and inward in an exploration of purpose and meaning. The ideas explored are for enjoyment and growth. Please consult with your healthcare provider if you need medical advice. Episode 1: The Dancing Star, the Entropic Brain, Nietzsche, and the Liberation of Consciousness. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his poetic masterpiece Thus Spoke Zarathustra, offered a diagnosis of the human condition that rings with peculiar resonance in the halls of modern neuroscience. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. For Nietzsche, the enemy of life was not suffering, but stagnation, the calcification of the spirit into rigid, unmoving forms. He feared a humanity that had become so orderly, so safe, and so predictable that it could no longer create, feel, or transform. For over a century, this was viewed as a metaphysical or aesthetic argument. However, recent developments in computational neuroscience, specifically the Entropic Brain Hypothesis, proposed by Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, have effectively translated Nietzsche's philosophy into the language of synaptic thermodynamic reality. The hypothesis suggests that the quality of our consciousness depends entirely on where our brain sits on a spectrum between order and disorder. While the critical brain hypothesis argues that a healthy brain operates at a phase transition between the two, the entropic brain hypothesis takes this further. It posits that many modern psychopathologies, depression, addiction, obsessive-compulsive disorder, are not disorders of chaos, but disorders of excessive order. They are Hyper-Apollonian states, where the brain has become a prison of rigid prediction. To heal, the entropic brain hypothesis states that we must induce a temporary Dionysian state, a surge of neural entropy that dissolves the structures of the self, allowing the system to escape its rut and re-crystallize in a healthier configuration. To understand why the brain needs chaos, we must first understand how it maintains order. In the Nietzschean framework, the Apollonian force is the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation. It is the boundary maker, the sculptor that separates me from you and subject from object. In the human brain, this Apollonian function is largely performed by the default mode network. The default mode network is a constellation of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, that is most active when we are not engaged in a specific task. It is the seat of the autobiographical self, the narrator that holds the story of who I am together. From an information theory perspective, the default mode network acts as a compression algorithm. The raw data of reality is overwhelming, a chaotic flood of sensory inputs. To navigate this, the brain relies on predictive coding. It generates a simplified model of the world and inhibits any sensory information that matches its predictions. It filters out the noise to create a streamlined, predictable narrative. Carhart-Harris identifies this normal waking state as secondary consciousness. It is characterized by relatively low entropy. It is constrained, hierarchical, and logically consistent. This is evolutionarily advantageous. To survive, an organism needs to know exactly where it is and what is likely to happen next. However, there is a cost to this efficiency. By aggressively filtering the world through past experiences and rigid models, the adult brain trades potentiality for predictability. It ceases to see the world as it is and sees only what it expects to see. Nietzsche warned of the last man, a creature of pure comfort and routine, incapable of dreaming. In clinical psychiatry, this manifests as internalizing disorders like depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder. The entropic brain hypothesis upends the common layperson's view of mental illness. We often imagine a mentally ill brain as broken or chaotic. However, the hypothesis argues that in conditions like depression, the brain is actually too stable. It is operating in a subcritical state. The priors, the top-down beliefs about the world, have become so heavy and rigid that they overwhelm bottom-up sensory data. Consider a person with severe depression. Their internal model tells them, I am worthless, the world is bleak, and nothing will change. This is a deep, energetic rut, a local minimum in the energy landscape of the brain. Even if positive events happen, the rigid default mode network rejects them as noise because they do not fit the dominant model. The neural pathways become deeply trenched. Like a river that has cut so deep into the canyon floor, It can no longer flood its banks to nourish the surrounding soil. This is the dark side of the Apollonian impulse. It is a tyranny of order. The self becomes a fortress so impenetrable that new information cannot enter. The system loses its criticality, its flexibility, and enters a state of deep, frozen stagnation. To break this rigidity, the system requires a shock. It requires the reintroduction of the Dionysian. In Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, Dionysus is the god who breaks the spell of individuation, collapsing the barriers between people and nature, returning the mind to a primal unity. Biologically, this is exactly what happens under the influence of classic psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, and DMT. These compounds act primarily on the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors, which are densely populated in the key hubs of the default mode network. When stimulated, these receptors cause the default mode network to disintegrate. As this conductor falls silent, the orchestra, the rest of the brain, begins to play in a wild, uncoordinated, yet highly interconnected manner. This is the shift from secondary consciousness to primary consciousness. In this state, the entropy of the brain skyrockets. The strict hierarchy of predictive coding collapses. Instead of information flowing neatly from the top down, expectations dictating perception, information explodes from the bottom up. Visual regions start talking to auditory regions. Memory centers communicate directly with emotional centers. The brain becomes supercritical. This matches the phenomenology of the mystical experience often reported in psychedelic therapy. The sense of self, the Apollonian construct, dissolves. The user feels oceanic boundlessness, a unity with the environment, and a flood of unconstrained imagery. It is the chaos Nietzsche spoke of, not a chaos of destruction, but a chaos of potential. By dismantling the rigid architecture of the ego, the brain returns to a state of high plasticity, similar to that of an infant. The therapeutic mechanism of this Dionysian shift is formalized in the REBUS model, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. Imagine the brain's beliefs as a landscape of hills and valleys. In a depressed brain, the valley of negative self-talk is incredibly deep and steep. A ball, representing the current state of thought, dropped into this landscape will inevitably roll into that deep valley and get stuck. It takes a massive amount of energy to push the ball out. The high entropy state induced by psychedelics acts like a seismic event that flattens the landscape. The steep walls of the depression valley melt away. The barriers between concepts come down. The ball is suddenly free to roam the entire landscape. This flattening allows the brain to escape the local minimum. It allows the individual to view their life, their trauma, and their behaviors without the crushing weight of their usual rigid narratives. They can see new possibilities and form new connections that were previously blocked by the Apollonian gatekeeper. This process is analogous to simulated annealing in metallurgy. To remove the defects in a piece of metal, you heat it up until it glows and the atoms become mobile, a state of higher entropy. In this fluid state, the atoms can rearrange themselves. Then, as the metal cools, returns to baseline, the atoms settle into a new, more optimal crystalline structure. Nietzsche did not argue that we should live in the Dionysian state permanently. To remain in the chaos is to be mad, unable to function or communicate. The goal was the synthesis, to visit the chaos and bring something back. Similarly, the entropic brain hypothesis does not suggest that the high entropy state is the end goal. The therapeutic value comes from the return. As the drug wears off, the default mode network begins to come back online. The landscape begins to reform. But, and this is crucial, it does not have to reform in the exact same shape. Because the system was heated up and the weights of the connections were loosened, the brain has a window of opportunity, neuroplasticity, to re-crystallize in a healthier configuration. The canyons of depression can be filled in, new paths can be paved. This is the biological realization of the tragic worldview. The healthy human mind is not one that avoids chaos, but one that can periodically dip into the entropy of the Dionysian to refresh its Apollonian structures. The convergence of Nietzschean philosophy and the entropic brain hypothesis offers a profound shift in how we understand mental health. For decades, psychiatry has largely operated on a model of chemical imbalance or broken parts. The hypothesis suggests a model of dynamic balance. It teaches us that order is not always good, and chaos is not always bad. Excessive order is the silence of the tomb. It is the inability to feel, to change, or to connect. To be alive, truly alive in the neurological and spiritual sense, is to inhabit the borderland. It is to maintain an Apollonian structure strong enough to navigate the world, but to keep the doors to the Dionysian open just wide enough to let the fresh air of chaos blow through. Nietzsche urged us to carry chaos within us. The entropic brain hypothesis confirms that without this chaos, without this occasional surrender to the unpredictable, our minds calcify. We need the storm to rewrite the map. We need the entropy to break the chains of our own predictions. Only by risking the dissolution of the self can we find the flexibility to endure, to adapt, and ultimately, to become the dancing star. Please share any thoughts you have in the comment section. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. As always, thanks for watching and listening.